means that the number one pick in the 2021 NBA draft goes to the Detroit Pistons.
Who's got the number one pick in this year's draft? Who's got the number one pick in this year's draft?
Basketball!
Select Isaiah Stewart.
The Detroit Pistons select Killian Hayes.
Saddiq, that was absolutely sensational.
I don't know what went into that process. I met the criteria to be selected, but I wasn't.
From long range. Oh! Yes!
Detroit Basketball! Hello, Pistons fans, and welcome back to another edition of the Palace of Pistons Podcast, brought to you by Believe. Aaron Johnson taking over the hosting duties this week as we're without Mike Anguilano, but joining me is the one and only Jasper Apollonia. Jasper, we got some fun stuff to talk about this week. How are you doing, my man?
I'm doing all right. I was excited for Mike to join us once again, but apparently he's doing some sort of other real estate venture. The guy's got more properties than Blackstone, so I don't know what's going on there, but hey, we got the two of us. We're still in those dog days of summer, but you're right, Aaron. We do have one, at least, maybe two topics to talk about today. So I'm ready to get into it. Let's do it.
Yeah, we might be in the dog days of the off season, but we're going to continue to bring you weekly shows. And you know what? Soon enough, we're going to be out of these dog days. We're only a handful of weeks out of training camp. This is really the last few weeks until we're going to have so much to talk about, actual things that are happening with the team. So very, very excited to get into all that. But first, let's hear a word from our sponsor. As always, it's BetOnline. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all your favorite sports, contests, and events with first-to-market odds and lines. Find reviews and news for every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports information, from live in-game betting, props, and futures. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device and join today to make your first sports bet. Use our promo code BELIEVE50, BLEAV 50 to receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, so our first topic of today's show relates to what's going to be something very, very important for the Pistons next season. Everybody knows that Cade Cunningham is the alpha dog of the Detroit Pistons. He is the general, the floor leader. He is the number one option. But behind him, question marks remain about who will fill in alongside him as the number two and number three options of this team next season. With a handful of young players and also a potential veteran that might have a bigger impact than anticipated, I think there's a grouping of guys that are all in the mix to potentially fill these roles. Jasper, who do you think right now is the lead candidate to be that sidekick somewhat to Cade Cunningham and fill in as that number two option for Detroit next season?
Well, Aaron, I have to say, coming into this season, I think it has to be Saddiq Bey. And we're going to talk about the other couple of guys. At least I have two other guys that I think could fill that number two scorer role. But I really do feel coming into this regular season, Saddiq Bey has to be that guy. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, you need to see where Saddiq Bey is at. And they did that last year coming into the season. They tried to give him a little bit more playmaking responsibilities. They tried to give him a little bit more of less of that catch and shoot and more of that driving to the basket, a little bit more interior play. And it didn't quite work out the way they wanted it to. But I think going into this season, they have to make the same effort. They do have to give him a real shot at solidifying his role as the number two guy, because the fact of the matter is he has been, over the last couple of years, their most consistent player. He's gotten the most playing time. He's played the most minutes. He's done the most on the floor. And I think he's earned that shot. Now, on the other hand, I think you have to look at it as more of a complete season kind of thing, because even though Saddiq's going to get that initial shot, Alec Burks is a player that frankly has been more efficient on pretty similar kind of opportunities for his career. So Alec Burks is going to push it. And on the other hand, you have another young player in Jaden Ivey, who hopefully is going to become more and more confident, more and more capable as the season goes on. So there's a really good chance that, yes, while Saddiq Bey may open as the number 2 option, he could be pushed down to number 4 by the end of the season, depending on how things go. Ultimately, best case scenario in my eyes is that Saddiq opens the season as their number 2 offensive option and is down to number 3 by the end of the season, because Jaden Ivey is such a revelation, because Jaden Ivey is pushing for that rookie of the year spot. Worst case scenario, I think Alec Burks is the number 2 offensive option on this team. And that's only going to be because Saddiq Bey isn't growing enough as a player in year 3, or because Jaden Ivey needs more time as a rookie in order to come into his own. So I think as of right now, it's got to be Saddiq Bey. But that could absolutely change as the season goes on, depending on how he performs and how those other 2 guys perform as well. I don't see another player that I really think is a contender for that number 2 offensive option role. Aaron, I don't know if you feel differently, but for me, those are the 3 guys I'm looking at.
I'm actually quite shocked on how in alignment we are on this, really from essentially every point that you brought up. I think it is Saddiq Bey's spot to lose at the beginning of the year. You look at the minutes that he's played, his familiarity in Detroit's system. This is a guy that is going to come in and command a big role at the beginning of the season. He's going into his 3rd year. This is when we see a lot of players tend to take that next step forward. So I think that there is a world where Saddiq Bey not only starts the year as the number 2 option, but finishes it, and it's not a disappointment because he's growing. And even if Jaden Ivey's playing well, like Saddiq Bey's just taking that next step. So I think he steps in day 1 going into training camp. That's the number 2 option. You know, Detroit's building their offense out around Cade, Saddiq, Jaden Ivey, but you know, Saddiq is going to be a guy that's going to get more volume, going to get more ball handling opportunities, going to get more sets run for him. And that will put him in a spot without Jeremy Grant taking so much volume away, so many possessions away, for him to really, really succeed as the number 2 guy. That being said, I also think that the best case scenario is Jaden Ivey is so good, is so impactful, that by the end of the year, Jaden Ivey's kind of right there, if not ahead of Saddiq Bey in the pecking order. And that's a lot to ask out of a rookie. But when we're talking about someone like Alec Burks potentially being a top 3 option on this team, that shows you that, hey, it doesn't matter that he's a rookie. There will be opportunity because Detroit doesn't have a lot of go-to guys on their roster outside of Cunningham, Burks, and Saddiq Bey. I mean, maybe you believe all the world in Marvin Bagley and you think he's going to, you know, you look at his production last year after the trade and you think, hey, he's going to start. He's going to get a lot of opportunity just because he can finish at the rim. He takes a lot of shots. Maybe, but there is absolutely a world where Jaden Ivey steps in as, you know, that secondary ball handler alongside Cade Cunningham and just has such a high usage that the opportunity is going to be there for him to score the ball, to make secondary reads as a distributor. He's going to rebound. He plays with speed. Like, he's going to get opportunities on both ends of the floor because of his athleticism, his size, his intangibles to really make an impact and solidify himself on a team that is something that I know both of us have really hammered home, doesn't have a ton of top end talent yet. So I think Jaden Ivey could end up being the guy. I think Saddiq Bey, I'm in agreement with you, is slated to be that number 2 guy. And this is no knock on Saddiq Bey whatsoever. I mean, he can take another step and solidify himself. But let's face it, his sophomore year was rather mundane compared to what I think a lot of us were hoping for. His stats really, didn't change much throughout the year. He was a sub 35% 3-point shooter pre and post All-Star break, 16.5 points per game, under 3 assists. He does some nice things, but for him to be the number 2 option long term, he's going to have to make some pretty serious improvements to his game if the Pistons are going to become a good team. That's why I think there's a world where it ends up being Jaden Ivey. I just think his potential, which is something that I talked about prior to the draft, something that was so appealing to me in terms of Detroit, having the opportunity to draft him, was his potential. He is a player that has all-star level potential, and an all-star level guy is a number 1, number 2 option on, essentially every team, unless you are a super team and you've got 3 all-stars. So I think it's going to be Saddiq Bey to start the year. I definitely see a world where it ends up being Jaden Ivey, by February, March, April. And if it's Alec Burks or if it's Marvin Bagley, then honestly, probably a lot's gone wrong for Detroit in 2022, 2023.
Yeah, and Aaron, I don't want to paint this as being like a make or break year for Saddiq Bey, because it's not. Look, he is, I think, at minimum, long term, a starter on a playoff team in this league. Like, I do think he's proven at least that he doesn't need to make big steps forward in order to be that type of player and solidify that kind of role on a solid team. So I don't want to paint it as, if Saddiq Bey does end up as the 3rd option, even the 4th option somehow, that's a failure of a season from him, because really what it could be is more of, like we've said, somebody like Jaden Ivey coming along and just being a total revelation. But on the other hand, if Saddiq Bey does maintain that level as the number 2 guy this year, I think that speaks more to his long-term potential than anything else. Look, do I think Saddiq Bey is an all-star ultimately? Probably not after last year. He didn't really take the steps forward that I was looking for. But I haven't completely given up on that. And I do think that he has an opportunity right now coming into his age 23 season where he can prove that, hey, yeah, Cade and Ivey are the big name guys right now, but I'm still here. And I absolutely should be part of a 3-headed trio, not just this, 2-headed monster. I will also say, I'm glad you brought up Marvin Bagley. I do think that there's the potential for him to even finish as high as 2nd in scoring on this team. It's very much there. But when we're talking about offensive options, I don't see him as being somebody that's going to take a big step forward in terms of handling the ball, getting the ball in his hands and making a bunch of post moves and driving the offense in any meaningful manner, because he's not a very good passer still. So I think he could finish as the number 2 scorer, but maybe not even the number 2 or 3 offensive option. So much of that could just come from pick and roll and dump offs and offensive rebounding, to where that's not exactly the role he's playing. Ultimately, though, yeah, I think we are definitely in agreement here. It's Saddiq Bey's role to lose at the beginning of the season. And depending on how this year plays out, he could lose that role and still have it be a successful season for him. I think we're in agreement on that, Eric.
I think in a bigger conversation with Saddiq Bey is, as much as we would like him to expand on his game, it might be more beneficial if he just mastered the things that he was good at. The 3-point shooting that we saw in his rookie season is something that Detroit's going to need. He can't have another year where he's shooting below 35% from the three-point line when he has, he has college track record, a rookie season track record of being a good three-point shooter. So he might not be a guy that ends up handling the basketball a ton, and that might stunt his ceiling. But if he masters some of the things that he's shown he's good at, letting someone like Jaden Ivey step into the fold over time, kind of take over as the number 2 guy, might not be the worst thing in the world for Detroit, long term at least. Maybe next year, especially at the beginning of the year, while Ivey's getting acclimated, they might and they will need Bey to have a significant role. But I don't think him, like you said, I don't think it'll be a failure of a season if Jaden Ivey is just that good and ends up overtaking him. That won't directly mean that Saddiq Bey underperformed.
No, not at all. If anything, yeah, that's a good point, Aaron. It could be a factor of just him pushing up from good to great in a few of the things that he's shown he's able to do. If he can just be like an over 42% catch and shoot guy from outside, like Alec Burks is, to be honest, I think that would help him and the team tremendously. If he is a player that teams constantly have to focus on, regardless of whether he's driving the offense or not, that's really what matters. It's about gravity. It's about shooting impact. It's about spacing. And you need players that can do that at an extremely high level. Maybe he's not Chris Middleton. Maybe he's, I don't know. I'm struggling of a comparison right off the top of my head. But the point is, maybe he's not that second offensive initiator. But that could be okay if he's great at the other things that he's shown he can already do at a high level. If he can push his defense forward, if he can push that catch and shoot forward, if he can finish at the rim, just, gosh, I mean, 2-3% higher than he has for his career, I think that makes him a completely different player in terms of how dangerous he is, how much defenses have to focus on him, and how much he can open up the floor for other guys, especially players like Cade and Jaden Ivey, who need that space to operate efficiently. So I really do think it could be one of those things where even if he doesn't make that step into number 2 option, like real number 2 option, he could still elevate his game and he could still elevate this team's potential in the long term.
Is Marvin Bagley gonna be the starting power forward to start the season?
Oh man, he could. I mean, that's another, if we're talking about that, it's something we've talked about all offseason, Aaron, is that front court rotation. I think we're pretty set. Jalen Duren is not going to be one of the top 3 front court options to start this year, but he very well could be in there to finish the year. And I mean, yeah, you said Marvin Bagley. Aaron, Kelly Olynyk could be the starting power forward for this team when it's all said and done. I mean, he does offer things that they need. They need passing. They need shooting. He can do those things. And, I've been a big believer in Isaiah Livers. I've been a big believer that they need somebody like him in that starting lineup. But I could absolutely see Dwane Casey going with Marvin Bagley for, those offensive reasons, that rim pressure. I could also see if they're committing to Stewart at center, they go, hey, maybe, we can offset that defensive liability of Olynyk a little bit by getting increased shooting, which Marvin Bagley can't offer. So I could see it working out in so many different ways, Aaron.
I do agree with that. And look, I don't think you can get a worse version of Kelly Olynyk than you got last year.
No, it's the worst year. It was one of the worst years of his career. Easily.
By far.
Yeah, and he followed up one of the better seasons of his career the year before. I mean, I know he got a little extra run in Houston because they had nobody to play, but like he had a good year, period. So
right.
Yeah, you do anticipate some sort of a bounce back as long as he can stay healthy.
Yeah, I mean, the way that his season went last year, it's just I can't foresee it happening like that again. I mean, this is a guy that in 8-9 seasons prior to last year played 64 more games each of those seasons. This is a guy that was regularly above the 70 games played mark. And like you said, maybe he got a little extra run in Houston, but this is still a guy that between Houston and Miami averaged 13.5 points, 7 rebounds, just under 3 assists, shot the ball better than he did last year in Detroit. So he is an albatross on defense. I don't know if you can fully make up for what he dilutes of your defense, even if you have great defenders around him. And I don't believe that Detroit has enough great defenders to really make up for that, for the problems that he's going to cause. But I do think there is some legitimate upside to what he can bring to the table offensively. If his shooting can come back, if he's just healthy. I mean, the guy couldn't move last year by the time that he came back. I mean, he suffered that ankle injury early in the year, came back, immediately got COVID. Once he came back from that, Dwane Casey was at multiple times saying, look, Kelly's just not himself. He's still struggling getting his wind back. He's not up to the level that he can be at. So an off-season off, getting fully healthy. We've seen some videos of him, in those famous, pickup games with some other professional basketball players and things like that. So everything you're seeing looks like he's healthy again. And I mean, it would be bad for Detroit if Kelly Olynyk wasn't able to play for them. But I think on the flip side, there's a world where he doesn't play for them because you have Bagley, you have Stewart, you have Nerlens Noel, you have Isaiah Livers, and you have Jalen Duren. I mean, at some point, Kelly Olynyk might end up out of the fold, but on the flip side, he could end up being your opening night starter. So it's a logjam of a situation up front for Detroit. I think the nice thing is they're going to have options. I don't think any of those options are necessarily great. I think they all have their perks. I think there are some drawbacks to each of them. But it sets up for Dwane Casey to have a lot of different options, which in a year where the Pistons aren't going to be very good, it's okay for them to have these different types of players to try different looks to see how the archetypes of these guys mesh with the core players of Cunningham, Ivey, Bey, Stewart, etc., etc.
Absolutely. And you know what, Aaron, you're right. There are so many different decisions for Dwane Casey to make with this roster. And this is now year 4 of his tenure here in Detroit. I'm kind of wondering where you're at with Dwane Casey, because he's been a coach that has been maligned by his former fan base in Toronto. He's been maligned at times here in Detroit as well, although he has gotten, I think, a lot of credit for kind of leading this young team and kind of giving them an identity. He's got a lot of tough decisions this year, more than he's had in years past, for sure. And while the Pistons aren't expected to be a playoff team, I think we certainly expect them to take a step forward in their progression, both as individual players and as a team. So, Aaron, maybe not just looking at this year, but going into next year, year 5, if Dwane Casey's team, this Detroit Pistons team, doesn't take a step forward this year, doesn't take a step forward into next year, or let's even forget next year. If the Pistons don't take a step forward this year, how hot is Dwane Casey's seat going to start to become? Because maybe not this year they're making the playoffs, but the expectation next year, I think 100% has to be they're making the playoffs. So if they don't take a step forward this year, where are we looking at with Dwane Casey going into year 5?
I don't think there's a ton of pressure on him currently. I think from everything that we've heard, this is an organization that is rather aligned on the front office the coaching staff. They're obviously taking a different approach, a different process than we've seen the Tom Gores-led Pistons take in years past, in regime past, with Stan Van Gundy and the slew of coaches that came before him. I think they're understanding that this is going to be a process. It's going to take time. And we're seeing that with how they're building out their roster too. This isn't Stan Van Gundy who's using up all of the cap space to overpay role players and things of that nature. Troy Weaver is being very selective with the guys that he brings in, and that's slowing down the Pistons improving in terms of record. There is pressure on Dwane Casey to stimulate the growth of these young guys on the roster. If you see a season where Cade Cunningham, Saddiq Bey, Jaden Ivey all underperform, regress, whatever, there has to be some pressure on Dwane Casey. I don't think that happens. I think everyone is very, very confident in what Cade Cunningham is going to become. I think from what we've heard out of the Pistons front office and just from what we've heard from different reporters and things of that nature is that some of these guys, Jaden Ivey and Saddiq Bey, are having strong off seasons. I know that people were very, very excited to see essentially the entire Detroit roster, 8, 9, 10 guys out at the Rico Hines runs with Stephen Curry, Draymond Green, Russell Westbrook. I mean, some of the elite NBA players, half the Toronto Raptors roster. So I think there's an expectation that these guys are going to take a step forward. I don't think it's going to be a major step forward in terms of record this upcoming season, and I think that's okay. But I do agree that going into the 2023-2024 season, the expectation is going to be, hey, Cade's going into year 3, Saddiq, Isaiah are going into year 4, Jaden Ivey's got a year under his belt. We're probably armed with another high-level lottery pick, and we had another offseason of max slot cap space to work with. It's time. Like, it's time to push our chips in and go for it. And if the Pistons come out then and are bad and don't come close to the playoffs, like, I guess if they make the play on it, I mean, this could all change. I mean, we're talking about 2 seasons from now. But if they don't, make the play in, make the playoffs, there has to be some pressure on Dwane Casey from that alone. Unless, you lose your top 2-3 guys to injury, this is a team that you can't just go year after year of lottery picks. You can't. Not when you have a high-level player like Cade Cunningham leading your team, and you have another lottery pick in Ivy, Saddiq, Stewart, cap space coming. This is a team that has to take steps. The step might not be playoffs this year, but 4, 5, 6 more wins this year, 7, 8, and the year after, getting closer to being a playoff team, getting into the play-in, making the playoffs. That has to be realistic when you're going to have what we think is going to be a top 10, 15 player in Cade Cunningham. So if the Pistons don't do that, and we're seeing frustration from the locker room, the lack of results in terms of the record, there's going to have to be pressure on Dwane Casey. I don't think there is right now. I think it would take some pretty significant things happening for there to be pressure in the short term. But down the line, the results are eventually going to have to start to show in terms of the wins and loss columns and playoff appearance column. And if that doesn't change soon, then there will be some pressure on Dwane Casey. Then there will be rumblings of him being on the hot seat.
Yeah, I mostly agree, Aaron. I don't think that unless he loses the locker room completely, a la John Kuster, he's not losing his job this year. Even if the Pistons don't win significantly more games. Even if they like stay at the same amount of wins, to be honest, I still think he's got his job. But after this year, I think going into year 5, the hot seats got to start getting hot. I think the expectation has to be play in or bust. And the reason I say this is that Dwane Casey is already the 3rd longest tenured head coach in Pistons history. He's only 26 games behind Stan Van Gundy. Obviously, Chuck Daly is number 1, and Dwane Casey would have to be here for a full decade in order to pass him. But yeah, it's not like, I know the Pistons have been bad, but it's not like he hasn't had any sort of a leash. And if you're going into year 6 of your tenure without having made the playoffs even once, I don't think that's acceptable. I don't think that that's something you can continue with, no matter how much you say, hey, we're building.
He'll have made it that the 1 year with Blake and Andre.
Oh, yes, of course, his first year. You're so right.
Essentially.
Okay, you're completely correct. I'm sorry. But still, that would
the conversation though. No.
It would still represent 5 straight years without making the playoffs.
Right. And you're talking about a team that has spent to acquire young talent. I mean,
absolutely. I mean, they have put in that they've given him pieces. Yes, it's not a complete team yet, but that's what this year is for. That's what this year has to be for. So if you don't manage to solidify this roster into a meaningful working core for next year, and that core is not able to take a step forward into the playoffs or even the play-in, I think he's got to be gone. I don't even think there can be a discussion. I think he has to be gone next year if they don't make it, because 6 seasons of no playoff wins, I don't really care what the excuse is. That's not acceptable for any franchise. I mean, even the Timberwolves wouldn't put up with something like that. Even the Kings wouldn't put up with something like that. If you're the Pistons, there's no way you should. So I think we're in agreement. Dwane Casey's not losing his job this year unless something absolutely insane happens. Maybe they trade Cade for Allen Iverson. But other than that, he's safe. Next year is when that seat's got to be really, really hot. Anything less is not acceptable to me as a fan.
We're in agreement there. We are in agreement there. That was our show this week. One final note was we did get the Pistons preseason schedule. We're going to play 4 games. Basketball's going to be back before you know it. And I know we're all kind of sitting on the edge of our seats waiting for college football, the NFL to come back. But the NBA is going to be back before you know it. Detroit's first preseason game is October 4th. They'll play 4 preseason games total against the Knicks, which will actually be broadcasted nationally on TNT. So the Pistons get multiple nationally televised games this year, folks. And then the other 3 are October 7th against the New Orleans Pelicans, October 11th against the Oklahoma City Thunder, which some devastating news for them with Chet Holmgren being announced as out for the season.
Aaron, you mentioned Kelly Olynyk playing pickup games. Hope you folks enjoyed that. That's not happening for a few years at least. No way NBA teams are going to let their guys do these type of like showcases next year. It's just not going to happen.
Just very, very unfortunate for him. And it sucks for the league in general. It sucks for him, Oklahoma City. Everyone loses because I think a lot of people were intrigued. Maybe they didn't believe in that Chet was going to come in and be, a big time player or anything, but they were still intrigued to see, considering the uniqueness of who he is as a player with his body type and everything. Very, very unfortunate that he got hurt. But Detroit will wrap up the preseason on October 13th against Memphis. And then they're a week out of the regular season beginning? Is it October 19th, October 20th? Something like that against Orlando. So it's going to be back. I mean, we are just a couple days out of September. We'll have media day. We'll have training camp. It's all going to be back. But before you know it. So these types of podcasts where we're kind of speculating on future
2 years in the future.
Right. What year does Jalen Duren become an all-star? Like those kind of topics, or they're going to be a thing of the past. as we get into the current events of the Detroit Pistons. But hey, a little bit of a shorter show for us this week. Don't always get under 40 minutes, but we got to the point this week, which we always try to do, but it always ends up being a 50-minute, hour-long conversation.
Well, I usually don't have a hot date I have to get to, but today's a little different. So I'm going to be completely honest. It's completely based on nothing but my baser desires. So yeah.
All right. Well, hey, I'm going to let you get to that date. I'm going to wrap us up here for this week. Jasper, thanks for joining me. Great conversation as always. Guys, keep your eyes out on palaceofpistons.com. Should have an article coming out most likely on Monday from Dylan Edenfield. Make sure you're following us on our socials, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You know the deal. If you're watching this somewhere where you can leave a like or drop a rating, certainly do that as well. We really, really appreciate it. But that's going to do it for us this week on the Palace of Pistons podcast, brought to you by Believe. Thanks to our sponsor, BetOnline. We'll see you guys next week. Have a good one, folks.